Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're all well. Thank God. This week's Parshas Bo is the conclusion of the story of the Jewish people in Egypt. Next week we'll have Parshas Beshalach, which will deal with the drowning of the Egyptians at the Red Sea, at Yam Suf. But that's outside of Egypt already, even though we could really say that the event is the culmination of the story, because there the Lord promised us, so to speak, that we're done with the Egyptians. Now, the Torah tells us that the Jewish people were in Egypt how long? So there are great conflicts in the dates that the Torah gives us. One place it says 400 years. Another place it says 430 years. Based on the gematria of the word redu. So the Medrash tells us they were there 210 years. And how long were they enslaved? Well, when Yosef was alive, really until Levi was still alive. Levi lived the longest of all of the brothers. There was no slavery. In fact, there was prosperity, freedom, acceptance. Jewish people were very happy in Egypt. So the Netziv in his parish to the Torah, the Amek Dover, he based upon Midrashim, he says that it was only 80 years that the Jewish people were enslaved. In other words, the last 80 years were years of slavery and persecution, years where the Jewish children were cast into the river, and all of the atrocities and all of the difficulties occurred. So why does the Torah do that? I mean, the thing that always amazed me about biblical criticism is the assumption that they were the only ones that found the contradictions and the problems in what the Torah said. In other words, the people who wrote the Torah, they said 400 years, they said 430 years. The Talmud says 210 years. So the biblical critics were smart enough to know that somehow 430 is not 210. But they couldn't ever imagine that the people who, so to speak, wrote the book also could figure that out. And if you want to write a book that is consistent, that has historical weight to it, so to speak, then you would clean all of that up. You wouldn't allow a book to go out that says 430 years and then says 400 years. And then they say the 430 was really 210 and the 210 was really 80. Obviously, there is a reason involved here, a pattern. There's something the Torah wants us to take notice of. So the Meforshim, based upon our tradition from Sinai, looked at all of this and said as follows. That the beginning of Golus Mitzrayim is not when Jacob descended to Egypt. And it is not when Levi died. And it's not the last 80 years. That's the culmination of Golus Mitzrayim. But Golus Mitzrayim, according to Rashi and all the Meforshim, begins with Avram Avinu in the Bris Bein Absorim, in the covenant that the Lord made with Avram Avinu. And there, Avram was informed, Ki ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem, va'avodum v'inu osam arba me'ov shana. There, this is going to happen to them. And that they'll be enslaved for 400 years. Now the Bris Bein Absorim is 430 years before. So it's only from the time that Yitzchak was born. That Yitzchak Avinu was born, that's when the 400 years begins. What is the idea of Golus Mitzrayim? The idea is that the Jewish people are going to somehow be strangers. Avram Avinu in the land of Canaan, even though he was a distinct minority and he was subject to all sorts of problems and wars, they said, Nasi Elohim ato b'sochenu. You're the Prince of God. We want you here. There have been midrashim regarding the Moritz HaMachpelah that the Bnei Ches really wanted to give it to Avraham Avinu. Ephron was the stubborn one. But the Bnei Ches knew that it was a great honor that Avraham Avinu would be buried, that Sarah Imenu would be buried there. Aside from the commercial advantages that always accrue to graves of great and pious people, because other people want to visit those graves and therefore they pay money to come, to go, etc. I mean, where would Uman be today if it were not for the fact that Reb Nachman of Breslov is buried there? Who would go to Uman? And therefore the Ukrainian government would never allow his remains to be removed. As I think it's certainly 40–50% of their tourism is based upon poor Reb Nachman. So the Golus begins with Yitzchak, even though they're still living in Eretz Israel. Because now in Eretz Israel, Yitzchak is told, Leich ki yotzamta mimenu. Go, you became rich on us. We don't want you here anymore. So that's the feeling of Golus. The feeling of Golus is we don't want you here. That's why I think it's pretty obvious. I know Jews still live in Europe. They're very stubborn. But it's pretty obvious that Europe doesn't want any Jews to live there. It's pretty obvious that it's not restricted to Europe alone. So you're already in Golus when you haven't physically moved yet. But your status of being is that you're in exile. You're unwanted. You don't belong there. You're not entitled to have roots there. And that's the beginning of Golas Mitzrayim. And therefore, this is a process over centuries. The Holocaust occurred over centuries. It didn't came to its culmination in the 1940s. But it has centuries in back of it that enabled it to happen. Someone turned off the light switch in a moment, and that's what created it. It's a process, a long process. And in that process, the Torah wants us to realize that we are in exile. It says the Moshe Bnei Yisrael of Eretz Mitzrayim. How long were they there? They were there 430. They weren't there that long, but they were. Because psychologically, spiritually, prophetically, that's when they were in Egypt already. They were exiled already. And that part of it is that the Jewish people apparently sensed it to a certain extent. That's what Chazal mean, that they didn't change their clothes, they didn't change their language, didn't change the way they behaved, even though they were idolaters. But even idolaters that are Jewish also are Jewish. And it seems to be the faith of the Jew that wherever he or she will be, they're in exile. Because that's the idea that we have in Kabbalah and Jewish thought, that the Shekhinah, God's, so to speak, God's spirit is also in exile always. Also is not at rest. So exile is not just a matter of geography, and it's not just the moment of, God forbid, persecution or of discrimination or of legal difficulties. Exile is a state of being. And the Torah wants us to know that we were there for hundreds of years in that state of being. And that even though the slavery was only 80 years at the end, we were slaves already. Because slavery, again, is not just a physical attribute, but it's a mental and spiritual one as well. So I want to thank you all for listening. And we should all be well, and we'll hear good news one from another. Thank you. 6 o'clock is the Parsha class. Thank you.